everyone. My name is Corrie Ellis, and I wanted to thank you very much for attending our Nearly Carbon Neutral conference. I really look forward to your questions, feedback, and discussion after this presentation. Today I'll be talking about red, white, blue, green, magenta, possibilities for solidarity in the anti-fracking movement.
In the magazine High Country News, historian Patricia Limerick outlines what she sees as, quote, the fractured terrain of oil and gas opposition, end quote, in the western United States. To fracture, to break or crack a hard object or material, connotes a permanent disconnection, or a kind of a distance created between two sides by a violent rupture. It also supposes that the thing that fractured was once a homogeneous whole or a unified whole. I think this framing reinforces division through the recognition of difference. And so in this talk, I seek to illuminate possibilities for growing through difference. So how can difference actually be a strength of social movements and the anti-fracking movement in particular? One thing that Patricia Limerick does do very well in this same article is she highlights the heterogeneity of people who are opposed and in support of oil and gas. So here, just to give you an idea, there are people on the top left. His family owns land that is leased to oil and gas, but he's against fracking. We see people in Colorado protesting for their right to have local control over oil and gas. A woman on the bottom right is affected by oil and gas drilling happening next to her property. And on the bottom left, we see a woman with her child with a sticker on the child's shirt that says oil and gas feeds my family and yours. They're at a pro-oil and gas rally in Colorado. So there are many different views on oil and gas, and it's not necessarily a clean-cut pro or anti in terms of sides. But I think that this actually, the heterogeneity of contexts and opinions and perspectives is something that the movement can use to build a more broad-based movement. So I'd like to think less about fracturing and something more like harmony. How can we build all of these disparate parts, bring them together? Perhaps a metaphor of a quilt might be more productive for these purposes. So today I'll be talking about observations that I've gathered in the context of a project called Dorothy's Davids and Goliath, Resisting Extreme Energy Extraction in Idaho and California. And within this project, I've collected over 100 in-depth interviews with activists in Santa Barbara County and in 3 communities in Idaho. And I've engaged in participant observation of activist groups for about 3 years in both settings. So I'm an activist scholar. I'm both a member of the groups I'm researching and then trying to use research to improve organizing on the ground. Today I'd like to focus on 2 kind of polar opposite ends of the spectrum of the people I've been speaking with. And so I'll be talking about the youth activists that I've seen organizing in Santa Barbara County. They're part of the global youth climate justice movement, and then activists who are working in conservative rural Idaho against fracking. Before I get into these 2 settings, I want to highlight a concept called relational organizing. I saw this as being really key for activists in both settings and something that facilitated other important aspects of their organizing. One interviewee, Emily Williams, described this very well. She said that relational organizing is rooted, quote, in having these really intentional one-on-one conversations that are not about campaign strategies. It's not talking about the campaign at all. It's focusing on getting to know someone, what's driving them, where they're coming from, and using a whole series of conversations to build up trust between 2 people so that when they organize together, there's that relationship built. And so on the UC Santa Barbara campus, University of California, student groups had used this type of relational organizing to good effect. One interviewee, Rob Holland, explained that the leaders of the big environmental groups and the cultural groups on campus were good friends, and so they knew when to show up to each other's events and show solidarity in that way to support each other. So again, this idea of relational organizing is really important in both of the settings I'm going to discuss. So I'll begin by talking about what's happening in southwest Idaho, where people are resisting fracking, and then move on to what's happening in Santa Barbara County. In Idaho, there's a group called Citizens Allied for Integrity and Accountability. And the fascinating thing about this group is that on their board they have people who have been former leaders of the Tea Party. They have climate change skeptics. They have people who identify as liberal, independent, conservative, Democrat. And all of these people are able to come together and work against natural gas extraction in their state. The group's primary aims are educating the public about fracking and then the lack of integrity and accountability in government at all levels and in industry. And so that part of their name, integrity and accountability, is really core to where they see their struggle. And then they're also, rather than using messages of environment or climate change, they focus on issues of property and public health, finding that these messages are much easier to gain broad-based support for in their context. And one other key point about Idaho is that it's never had any economically viable oil and gas production until 2009. So in a way, this is the frontier of the fossil fuel industry. From these activists, I've learned 3 important ways to build solidarity. And so the first that I want to discuss is talking across lines. One interviewee, Jim Plusinski, explained this to me, and he said that when you're working, organizing in a community, you can take out one piece of paper, fold it into thirds, and then you can write down everything that you'd see on the left and everything you'd see on the right, kind of the hot button political issues that make people put up barriers and make them unable to have conversations with people they disagree with. So on the left, you might see climate change, environment, abortion, guns, and you see many of these same things on the right, maybe in addition to things like small government. And so Jim said it's important to recognize what can we put down the center, what are things that most people can agree on and things that we can work together on. So here you might see things like community, health, home and property, water, air and soil, government accountability, business integrity, and public infrastructure. And so it is these things in the center that organizers and grassroots groups should really focus on in order to build community support. Another key lesson is complicating labels. So this particular group, all of their members really eschew political labels and see them as a dividing tactic by industry. And so just to give you 3 examples of what this can look like and how labels are often much messier and complex than they are set up to be. We can think about things like someone being pro or anti oil and gas. And this, again, it's not clear cut. People can actually change their views over time. So many interviewees who are now activists originally thought that oil and gas might be a good thing. They were attracted by the appeal of becoming Jed Clampett, having oil or gas coming out of their land and becoming millionaires overnight. They quickly realized this was not the case, and then many started resisting the industry. Another interviewee, Brenna Smith, she explained how she's not all out against oil and gas, but she thinks it shouldn't be done where it will affect people or where it could contaminate water or land. And then she kind of laughed to herself and said, oh, that eliminates most places. So you see there's a complexity here to people's perspectives. There's another issue called NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and this is typically a critique of people who become environmental activists just to get it out of their backyards. But in fact, the majority of the people I talked to had actually gotten involved when it was not directly affecting them. And as Shelley Brock explained, quote, I would be fighting this hard if it was just going to be in Emmett, which is a town about 20 minutes from where she lives, because the injustice of it, just infuriates me. And so many of my interviewees were really concerned and became active because of this notion of injustice and that the gas and oil industry was just steamrolling communities and it was just wrong. A final point that I want to raise is that even people who are skeptics in terms of climate change can be very much anti-fracking activists and against this industry. And so Peter Dill, who he's not convinced that climate change is not a natural thing, and he believes that God created the earth, but he says, quote, I mean, at the root of it, for us it comes back to how are we doing as stewards of the earth? What we know very clearly is that our generation is a heavy polluter, and we have no business doing that, end quote. And so you see from all of these examples that just because someone might have been pro-industry at one point or might not believe in climate change does not mean that they are not an important part of this movement to end extreme oil extraction. The third component from Idaho that I want to discuss is the importance of being able to agree to disagree. So as Wayne explained, quote, check your party affiliation at the door. This is a tactic that the group uses, and so they recognize that they have different perspectives on things, and they choose to check these things at the door so they can come together and work on what they do agree on. Another way to do this is to actually build a very deep relationship of trust so that you can eventually begin to have conversations about the things that you disagree on. And then rather than kind of exploding into an argument or something, you can actually just have a conversation of respect and agree to disagree. But perhaps over time, one or the other of the people in the conversation might begin to change their mind. A good example of this is Alma and Jim, pictured here, who are board members of Kaya and are husband and wife. And Alma is very concerned about climate change, and Jim is a climate change skeptic. Yet they're able to work together to stop oil and gas extraction. So now, moving from this context of rural conservative Idaho to the very liberal context of Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara also has long been a place where oil and gas extraction has been happening. So we pioneered offshore oil drilling in the late 1800s, and then we've also had two oil spills, the infamous larger spill in 1969 and then one just last year in 2015. Both of these sparked a lot of community resistance and environmental organizing. Similarly, on the University of California, Santa Barbara campus, students are very active. There are 40 student groups dedicated to sustainability. Students worked on a ballot initiative in 2014 to ban extreme oil extraction, Measure P, and UCSB has been named the greenest public university in the US by the Princeton Review in 2015. So this is the context in which many of the youth interviewees in this research are organizing. Again, I have three kind of best practices for building solidarity that I learned from these youth activists. The first is the idea of calling in. And so there's in the environmental movement, which has typically been a very white middle class movement, it's been important to call out instances of oppression and to hold activists accountable to doing things that reinforce oppression. And so there's a practice of calling out where you call attention to that behavior in a very kind of abrasive way. There's another tool that is similar that activists have been developing, and this is calling in. As this article from blackgirldangerous.org explains, this is a less disposable way of holding each other accountable. So this recognizes that even the best among us make mistakes in terms of oppressive behavior, and that we are still valuable members of the movement, and we should learn from these mistakes and move forward and build relationships of trust. And so to call someone in to inappropriate behavior and to changing that behavior is kind of a more relational way of doing this and valuing that person and your relationship with them. And so this is something that I see the youth doing. They're calling each other in across different lines, whether these be their majors, their race or ethnicity, or the activist groups that they are in. They're kind of trying to work together and learn from each other. Another thing that these youth activists in Santa Barbara are very good at is, I think, recognizing their privilege and exploring the importance of intersectionality. Intersectionality is the idea that all of our identities come together to inform our lived experience of power and oppression. And this statement from the California Student Sustainability Coalition is an exemplar of these youth recognizing these things. This was a statement written in solidarity with Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, and a couple of my interviewees signed on to this statement. And they say, our struggle and liberation is indelibly bound to the liberation of others. We cannot have climate justice or a sustainable planet without racial justice. Our movements must be intersectional because our lives are, our very identities are. If we want freedom from the fossil fuel industry, from tuition hikes, we also must have freedom from racial injustice. We also, however, recognize that we are part of a larger community that holds a lot of privilege, so that they recognize they're coming into organizing through college. Our struggles may or may not be the same, but are bound nonetheless. That's the end of that segment, and so I think this illustrates the wisdom of these youth organizers. Finally, something that these activists do well is that they organize horizontally, meaning that they rarely have a hierarchical leadership structure of a vice president and a president. Often they'll have co-chairs, or they'll have, in the case of a group I'm a member of, 350 Santa Barbara, no leadership structure. And so this empowers everyone to take on leadership responsibility. They also practice inclusive organizing practices. So these are things like anti-oppression, which could be going around a circle, and when everyone introduces themselves, they might also introduce how they would like to be referred to, their gender pronouns, preferred gender pronouns, which might be she, her, he, him, or they, them. They work to have the group and the leadership reflect the community they're working in, so to have racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, and they also work to connect and prioritize the connections between social and environmental and climate justice issues. In conclusion, talking across lines and calling each other in help activists build community unity against corporate efforts to divide and broad-based movements capable of challenging the fossil fuel industry. Relational organizing is fundamental to all of the ways activists practice solidarity building. In highlighting how diverse facets of the anti-fracking movement prioritize common goals, goals for solidarity, and working across lines of difference, this talk demonstrates how difference in the movement does not represent fractures, but rather potential for building the diverse, inclusive, and powerful movement that climate crisis requires. This project suggests that energy extraction in the age of climate crisis can call forth common values and common understandings of social problems. The practices activists create from their common values and understandings are fundamental to nurturing resilient social relationships for living in and hopefully emerging from climate crisis. Thank you very much.